This is Port Meadow, which is the largest area of common land in Oxford, which is where we come from. The management of the commons first arose to manage natural resources like the grazing of common lands like these. But I want to talk about a different kind of global commons, namely the management of infectious disease. So infectious disease raises lots of interesting issues about common grounds, because each time one of us is infected and ill, we're also infectious and so pose a risk to those around us. As I said, that raises many issues about the role of the individual in the control of infection in a community, and I want to talk about just one of those, which is managing the emergence of drug resistance. These two squiggly lines represent the neuraminidase gene of H1N1 influenza. It's actually the old seasonal flu. There's this single difference, which is pretty hard to spot between the two. The top one is drug sensitive, the bottom one is drug resistant. That single point mutation renders our first line drug, Tamiflu, pretty much useless. We learned from treating HIV that treating viruses like flu or HIV with single drugs is a mistake because it drives drug resistance. Nobody would treat HIV with a single drug now, and regimens that contain up to 4 drugs are very common. It's not just a problem for viruses. So back in the 1940s, chloroquine was introduced to treat malaria, and by the 1950s, chloroquine resistance was common. And for the past 70 years, we've been in a pharmacological arms race with malaria, in which we introduce new drugs, but then we drive the emergence of drug resistance. At the moment, we only have one good drug left, and that's the artemisinin-based compounds. But sadly, just now, this year, malaria parasites were described in Western Cambodia that are developing drug resistance to these drugs, and that's despite really quite careful efforts to try and slow the spread of drug resistance by only using these drugs in combination therapies. So is it always hopeless? I'd like to argue not. I'm going to use TB as a study to think about, well, what can be done about this? Now, TB is an enormous global health problem. Don't get me wrong that I think TB is solved, but there are intense shared efforts to try and resist the spread of drug resistance for TB. And a cornerstone of that is that every time, in many countries, every time a TB patient takes their TB drug, somebody is there to watch them do it, a healthcare worker or a volunteer. It's called DOTS, for Directly Observed Treatment Short Course, and it's the cornerstone of Stop TB. Stop TB is a big global alliance of agencies working to eliminate TB as a public health problem. And if you look at the statement of principles and values of Stop TB, what you see is that they match right up with the properties that allow a bunch of users of a resource to make an effective institution to regulate that resource. So back to influenza. I already told you that just one point mutation makes H1N1 flu resistant to Tamiflu, and I can tell you now that this is a virus that makes mutations all the time. In the old seasonal flu, the drug-resistant form is very fit. That means it spreads between people, or ferrets. Ferrets is actually the animal model for flu, just as well as a drug-sensitive form. It grows perfectly well inside people. And that causes real problems because it means that the drug-resistant form can spread very well, even if you don't have it driven by an awful lot of treatment. And that's exactly what happened in Europe during the winter 2 years ago, the winter 2007-2008. At the beginning of that winter flu season in Europe, most of the H1N1 flu was drug sensitive. But as you can see, by the end of that season, just a few months later, the majority of H1N1 flu was drug resistant. Now let me tell you that in that winter, fewer than 1 million prescriptions for Tamiflu were written in Europe. The pandemic flu also has an N1 neuraminidase gene, so what about swine flu? At the end of last year, the old seasonal flu was virtually all drug resistant. But at that time, and still now, the vast majority of pandemic flu is still drug sensitive. But this drug resistance is like a bad thing in Pandora's box. Once it comes out, because there's virtually no fitness cost to the resistance mutation, you can't get rid of it again, no matter how much you restrict who has access to the drugs or how they use them. So the continuing existence of these drug-sensitive viruses is a global commons. And when we blindly treat the drugs that treat these things as though they were consumer goods, they can suffer from a tragedy of the commons. Now, we know from the management of more common resources, the more common pool resources, that if people can communicate freely about how to use their resources, if there are ways to enforce what they agree, and if everybody agrees that the long-term exploitability of the resource is very important to them, then it's possible to make good rules that people will stick to so as not to have a tragedy of the commons. And I'd like to argue that we ought to use those sorts of things we know about managing resources more widely in the management of infectious disease.